Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think affects all of us,
Mm-hmm.
whether we realize it or not,
Yeah.
and that is optimism bias.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever felt unshakably confident about a project,
Ah.
even though you've barely started?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe you're convinced your favorite sports team is going all the way this year, despite their less than stellar track record?
Oh, yeah.
That, my friend, could be optimism bias whispering in your ear.
Interesting.
This is a fascinating quirk of our brains,
Yeah.
where we tend to overestimate the
Mm-hmm.
good stuff coming our
All
way
right.
while conveniently downplaying the
Yeah.
potential for things to go wrong.
Makes sense. And what's really intriguing is that this isn't just about having a sunny disposition. Optimism bias is considered a full-fledged cognitive bias,
Okay.
meaning it's a systematic deviation from rational thinking. That colors how we perceive risk and probability.
So it's more than just seeing the glass half full. It's like we're wearing those rose-colored glasses all the time,
Mm.
maybe even a bit oblivious to the cracks in the glass.
Right.
But let's back up a bit. How do we even define optimism bias in a way that sets it apart from just being, well, optimistic?
That's a key distinction. Optimism in its healthy form can be a fantastic motivator. You know, that spring in your step
Yeah.
that helps you tackle challenges and pursue goals. Optimism bias, however, is more about having a skewed perception of reality.
Okay.
It's like thinking you're more likely to win the lottery than others, or underestimating your chances of getting that nasty flu that's going around.
Oh, yeah.
It's this comparative optimism, the belief that good things are more likely to happen to us than to others,
Uh,
and bad things, well, those are more likely to happen to someone else.
so it's not just about being positive. It's about having a distorted sense of our own risk
Right.
compared to everyone else. It almost sounds like a bit of self-deception, doesn't it?
In a way, it is. And researchers have been digging into the roots of this self-deception, uncovering some fascinating insights into the neural mechanisms at play.
Yep.
For instance, a 2010 study published in Current Biology
Right.
found a direct link between dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, and our tendency toward optimism bias.
So there's a chemical component.
Right. They found that boosting dopamine levels actually amplified this bias,
Wow.
suggesting that our brains might be wired
Yeah.
to lean towards the brighter side, even when it's not entirely rational.
Wow. So there's actual brain chemistry involved.
Yeah.
It's not just wishful thinking. It's like our brains are giving us a little dose of optimism, whether we want it or not. But if this bias is so ingrained in our biology, how do scientists even go about measuring something? As slippery as optimism,
Right.
it seems pretty subjective.
You're right, it is subjective, but researchers have come up with some clever ways to measure it. One approach is the direct measurement approach,
Okay.
where they ask individuals to compare their likelihood of experiencing an event to others. So they might ask something like, compared to other drivers, how likely are you to get into a car accident?
And I'm guessing most people would say
Yeah.
they're less likely.
Exactly. Even though statistically that can't be true for everyone,
Right.
that difference in perceived risk is what reveals the optimism bias.
Okay.
Another method is the indirect approach, which is more about reading between the lines. Researchers might ask participants to estimate things like the average salary for someone with their level of education.
Uh-huh.
If they consistently overestimate their own salary in comparison, that can point to optimism bias at work.
It's like a detective game for cognitive biases.
Yeah.
So we've got this brain-based bias
Yeah.
that researchers can actually measure. But where does this all play out? In the real world,
Yeah.
does optimism bias just stay in our heads? Or does it actually impact our choices and actions?
It absolutely impacts our actions, and sometimes in ways that can have significant consequences.
Go.
Take mega projects, for example. Massive infrastructure projects like bridges and tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
A 2018 study in sustainability looked at bridge projects in China and found that optimism bias among planners was a major culprit behind cost overruns and delays.
That makes sense. If you're overly optimistic about how smoothly things will go,
Right?
you might underestimate the time, resources,
Right.
and potential roadblocks,
Exactly.
leading to some serious budget headaches down the line. And it's not just about bridges and budgets. This bias pops up in all sorts of unexpected places.
It does.
Let's shift gears for a moment and consider the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay.
Remember those early days when the virus was spreading rapidly?
A 2020 study published in Games surveyed people in Italy and Romania
Right.
and found that even during a global pandemic, optimism bias was alive and well.
Oh, wow.
People consistently believed they were less likely to contract COVID-19 than others, even when faced with mounting evidence of the virus's contagious nature.
So even with all the information out there, people were still downplaying their personal risk.
Yes, it's like this bias is so strong it can even override our rational understanding of a very real threat.
It's almost like our brains are trying to protect us from feeling overwhelmed by the potential dangers.
It could be, yeah.
But you know what? I'm willing to bet that optimism bias isn't limited to serious stuff like pandemics and mega projects. Doesn't it also show up in, say, the world of sports?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Your fans are always convinced their team is going to win, even when the odds are stacked against them.
All the time. Sports fandom is a prime example of optimism bias in action.
Okay.
A 2015 study in PLOS1 found that fans consistently overestimate their favorite team's chances of winning, while underestimating their rivals.
Interesting.
And this bias can be amplified in sports where past performance is a strong predictor of future outcomes.
Okay.
Like in the NFL, where teams carry momentum from season to season.
So it's like the more invested we are emotionally, the more likely we are to let optimism bias color our perceptions.
It seems that way.
Makes me wonder, is there anything we could do to combat this bias? Or are we destined to walk around with these rose-colored glasses forever?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The good news is that research suggests we're not completely at the mercy of our biases.
Oh, good. Okay.
There's evidence that we can actually train our brains. To be more realistic,
Something like that.
one study, published in 2021 in Transportation Research Part F,
Okay.
looked at ways to reduce optimism bias in young drivers,
Oh, yeah.
a group notoriously known for overestimating their abilities behind the wheel.
I remember those days. Thinking I was invincible and could totally handle any situation on the road.
Precisely. So this study compared two interventions.
Yeah.
One involved providing drivers with a clear definition of good driving, emphasizing the skills and behaviors associated with safe driving.
So one focused on knowledge
Yes.
and the other on practical experience.
Right.
What did they find? Did these interventions actually work?
Interestingly, both interventions were successful in reducing optimism bias.
Really?
The hazard perception test, however, had a slightly stronger effect overall,
Right.
which suggests that active engagement and real-world simulations can be particularly effective in challenging biased thinking.
That makes a lot of sense. It's one thing to read about safe driving practices, but actually encountering hazardous situations in a simulated environment
Right. Yeah.
forces you to confront those risks more directly.
Exactly.
And the study also found that the effectiveness of the interventions varied.
Based on individual factors like
Okay.
sensation seeking and
No.
past risky driving behaviors, this suggests that a one-size-fits-all approach might not be the most effective way to address optimism bias.
Okay.
We need to consider individual differences and tailor interventions accordingly.
That's such an important point. It's like personalized medicine for our minds.
Yeah.
We can't just assume that one technique will work for everyone.
Yeah.
We need to consider individual personalities, experiences, and even their specific areas of bias.
I agree.
But before we get too carried away, with all these debiasing strategies, I can't help but wonder if there's a downside to reducing optimism bias.
That's a good point.
I mean, a little bit of optimism can be a good thing, right? It helps us stay motivated, pursue our goals, and cope with challenges. What happens if we swing too far in the other direction and become overly pessimistic?
That's a crucial point to consider. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. A healthy dose of optimism can be incredibly beneficial. For our mental and physical well-being, it's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between unrealistic optimism and debilitating pessimism.
So it's not about eradicating optimism altogether, but about cultivating a more balanced and informed perspective.
Exactly.
We need to be aware of our biases, both optimistic and pessimistic, and strive for a more accurate view of reality.
I think that's key.
Seems like this optimism bias is a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Too much.
Yeah.
And we risk making some serious miscalculations.
Right.
But a little bit might actually be the fuel that keeps us going.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This tension between a bias that can lead us astray, yet also seems to be woven into the fabric of our motivation and resilience.
Yep.
Perhaps the key takeaway here is that awareness is our superpower. By understanding how optimism bias operates, we can become more discerning thinkers and make more conscious choices.
You know, you're right. This whole conversation
Yeah.
has been like shining a light on a blind spot I didn't even know I had.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how many other subtle biases are lurking in the shadows, influencing our thoughts and decisions
Right.
without us even realizing it.
There's a whole world of cognitive biases out there, each with its own fascinating quirks and potential pitfalls.
Yeah.
But the good news is, the more we learn about them, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of our own minds.
So instead of just going with our gut, we need to take a step back, examine our assumptions, and maybe even seek out different perspectives to challenge our own thinking.
Yeah.
It's almost like we need to become our own cognitive detectives.
Exactly. And by cultivating this critical awareness, we can harness the power of optimism
Yeah.
without falling prey to its potential downsides. We can learn to distinguish between blind faith and a more grounded, realistic optimism that fuels our efforts without distorting our view of reality.
This deep dive has been truly enlightening. We've gone from defining optimism bias to exploring its real-world consequences and even uncovered strategies to mitigate its negative effects.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm walking away with a new set of mental tools to make more informed and balanced choices.
And that's the beauty of knowledge, isn't it? It empowers us to understand ourselves and the world around us a little bit better. So the next time you find yourself feeling overly confident or downplaying a potential risk, take a moment to pause and ask yourself, could this be optimism bias nudging me in a particular direction?
That's a great takeaway. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the intriguing world of optimism bias. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and learned something new along the way.
Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning. And remember that a healthy dose of skepticism can be a powerful ally in navigating the complexities of life.
And as always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive on